December 3rd, 2024, President Yoon Suk-yeol's sudden declaration of martial law once again put South Korea's democracy to the test. Fortunately, this incident has been positively evaluated as an opportunity to reaffirm the mature democratic consequences of the nation and its people. To discuss the background of these evaluations, we have invited an expert to join us. We welcome Professor David Tizzard from Seoul Women's University. Professor, welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to be here and it's great to see you.
So, having lived in South Korea for 20 years in your case,
yes.
How did you perceive people's action between the martial law declaration and impeachment motion?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that it happened very late at night. And it happened in a modern Korean way, which is bali. It all sort of took place in the space of just a few hours while much of the Western world was awake and watching this in real time. Many Korean people were in bed. This was happening in the early hours of the morning. However, what happened is that we saw Korean people take immediately to the streets, despite the cold weather, despite the hardships, and despite the confusion and the unbelievable actions that were taking place. Korean people were quick to be present. They were quick to be physically visible in the city of Seoul. Not just Seoul, I should say. People were taking to the streets in other parts of the country as well. And I completely expected this because
really?
Korean people do protest. They do take to the streets. I'm sure you're well aware of this, but trying to move around downtown sometimes between Gwanghwamun by Seoul Station or Yeouido, my international students from, let's say, because we're talking about democracy, from China, from Singapore, they often look at me and say, Professor, do Korean people always protest like this? And I have to say, yes, they do. It's almost sort of become a national pastime as much as hiking has or going to a baseball game. So the reaction did not surprise me. The president's decision very much surprised me. I don't think anybody expected that. But the fact that Korean people were so quick to act, the fact that what they chose to do was non-violent protest and measurement in numbers, I think that's very much in keeping with what we would expect from modern South Korea. So
compared to other countries with long-standing democratic history, South Korea's democracy is relatively young, right? But what we have seen recently was very, very peaceful demonstration and protest, as you mentioned already. So what factors actually contributed to the evolution of South Korea's democracy?
That's a really good question because South Korea used to be a far more violent society. People that have been here far longer than me would say that they would open windows and smell the tear gas and they would know which way the wind was blowing and where the protests were that day. People that have been here longer than me talk about the techniques that they learned to use to throw Molotov cocktails so they wouldn't get fuel on their arms as they threw it overarm or underarm. There's jokes about people being taken to Namsan, and while we do joke about that, there were very tragic and serious consequences, and we have sort of political martyrs such as Lee Han-yeol, Park Jong-chol, and these people that have stood and given their lives for Korean democracy. So we should not forget those that have given their lives, those that have sacrificed for it to be where it is today. Now, when we talk about Korean protests and Korean democracy, it seems to be a reflection of Korean society more broadly. So let me just try to answer by saying that in modern day Korea, despite what extreme representations there might be online, this society is very safe. This society is one where you can leave your laptop, your possessions, your mobile phone on a coffee shop table and go to the bathroom or go outside and come back and expect it to be there. This is a society where generally women feel safe to walk the streets at night and they don't feel under the threat of attack or sexual harassment, although of course this is not a perfect society. Children can play in the streets. Convenience stores are left unmanned because we don't expect things to be stolen. Overall, South Korea has developed into a very calm and safe society for the majority of citizens. Not to say it's without its problems, but it's generally very safe. and the protests have evolved in a similar way. And we've seen the 2016 protests, and these are a big symbol. They were there to commemorate the tragedy of the Seoul and the sinking and the loss of hundreds of young lives. But what's happened is that these peaceful protests, South Korean people have realized that they're effective. They work, and there's two reasons for this. If you show force or if you show aggression towards the state then has the right to show force and aggression back to you. Sociologist Max Weber once described the state as that which has the monopoly on the use of violence. The state is allowed to use violence, but people aren't. And so if you do use violence against the state, if you tip over cars, if you set things on fire, if you throw things, the state, the government, the police, the military, they will do that back to you, and it puts your lives at risk. And it also perhaps undermines your own position. So the first thing is South Korea has evolved this peaceful democratic protest because it's effective, because it works, and it keeps the people safe, and it allows for greater numbers to come in. So I mentioned China and Singapore, how they don't have protests, and I'm comparing Korea here to other Asian countries. If you look at Indonesia, or countries like this, they do have protests, but they're dangerous. You wouldn't want to go to these protests with your young children. What we've seen now in South Korea is because of the peaceful nature of these protests, because that they are effective, it also allows young women to go to these protests. It allows children to go to these protests. It allows older people to go to these protests, and they don't fear for their safety. They don't fear for their physical safety. And that means you can have greater numbers, and that gives greater political support, and it allows more of society to voice their opinions. So on the blood of those that have come forward, South Korea now has a very peaceful society, and its protests and its protest culture reflect that as well, I believe.
And what was very interesting to me was an active participation of young generation this time, right? So traditionally, we've been thinking that they are somewhat indifferent to political or social issues, but this time they were very active. So what do you think motivated them to engage?
I often think that we get young people wrong. I think they are politically active. I think they are conscious. I think they're empathetic. I think they've gone a step further than our generation in many ways, in that they're more open and they're more understanding of different identities and different people than we were. Sometimes in Korea, because it grew up with more poverty, it grew up with less education, parents weren't always educated how to raise their children, how to teach love and empathy and openness. This current generation of Gen Z, however we might term them, these young people, they are very open, they are empathetic, and they look at the world around them, and they want to inhabit this world, and they want to inhabit it with their values. Now, why did they come out in such numbers for this when we sometimes perceive them as apathetic towards politics? It's because politics is generally boring, and it's designed to be that way. You have sort of very non-entertaining figures fighting with each other in what seems like personal battles. For the last few years in South Korean politics, it seemed like a fight between the Yodang and the Yadang, a ruling party and an opposition party. And rather than working for the people, rather than trying to build something, what this country was so great at doing was building something for the people, we've just seen sort of two political factions use prosecution and the law to put opposition party members, family members, relatives in jail. And I think everybody's looked at the politics the last few years and said, is this the best we have? Are these the people that are meant to take the country forward? South Korea used to have statesmen, and whether you liked them or loathed them, these were big, grand figures that sort of represented the nation. At the moment now, it seems we have like career politicians that are trying to better themselves and their family and their immediate surrounding people, but not work for the better of the nation. So I can understand that young people would feel put off by politics. And one last point on this is that politicians rarely speak in the language of young people. They rarely address these young people, and they rarely communicate in a way that seems real. Things are very micromanaged and staged, and you know, we saw President Moon, he didn't really give many talks with the people. He sort of stayed very far back, because if you say the wrong thing, you can come into trouble. And we saw that with President Park Geun-hye, we've seen that with President Yoon as well. And so even the Progressive Party, and the last thing I'll say on this is that in the last presidential election, the Progressive Party, they had the oldest candidate. And you can say many things about Shim Sang-jung, but she was older than everyone else. And so there's very little representation of young people in politics, in South Korean politics. So it was lovely to see young people in the streets.
Yes, of course. Actually, the crisis once again reminded us of the importance of protecting democracy in South Korea, and the active participation of young generation in this process probably have some significant meaning for the future of democracy in South Korea.
Yeah.
How do you see their involvement in the future of South Korea's democracy in this regard?
They are the future. Clear and simple, they are the future. I think we should probably say that that democracy is not voting. Going to vote once every 4 years or once every 5 years, that's not what democracy is. Democracy is a state of mind. Democracy is this idea that your voice matters, your opinion matters, and you get to choose the direction in which the country goes. And even if the country goes in a different direction, your voice should nevertheless be represented. Now, this has been, it's a psychological awakening of the mind. And this has taken a long time for South Korea. I mean, the country was established in 1948, but for the longest time, people would not challenge authority. You could look in the classroom, you could look in the family, you could look in the office, and there's the boss, there's the manager, there's the professor, and you don't cross that power distance. You don't suggest that they might be wrong. Democracy is seeing everybody as equal. Democracy is one person, one vote, one person, one voice, and these voices do matter. And it's taken sort of decades for this to happen. It gets its democracy in '88, but now young people are realizing my voice does matter. And that person's voice is not worth more than mine just because they're older, or just because they have a degree, just because they're a man, just because they're a woman, or whatever qualifications. Democracy is about we all matter. And I believe the young people of South Korea, they realize that now. We sometimes lament South Korea for not being where it is in, let's say, Canada or France or Sweden or Norway. We love to compare South Korea to these countries in terms of its development or democracy. But South Korea is almost like a teenager with a PhD. It only became a democracy in 1988. Its citizens only first really started traveling abroad since 1989. People like me walking the streets, when I first arrived, young children would look at me and point and say, 미국인 온다. I'm from the United Kingdom. But this is a very young country. And this is in a part of the world where democracy is not the norm. Just look to the north. They don't have democracy in Pyongyang. They don't have democracy in Beijing. They don't have democracy in Vietnam either. South Korea is a beacon in this part of the world, and it's because of the young people. It's because they've grown up on social media. We say a lot of bad things about social media, addiction, attention, but these young people in South Korea, they won't allow a dictator to take control of this country anymore. Of course, people will want to, but young people realize and they value freedom. They want to be able to choose what YouTube video they want to watch. They want to be able to choose who they meet. They want to be able to choose what hairstyle they will have. And I'm pretty sure that if we trust them, here's the big thing. I think we're very reluctant to trust young people. We think they're selfish or lazy or disinterested. We don't want to hand over power to them. And that's a mistake, because this is their future as much as it is ours.
Yes, of course. I hope this crisis and experience of this can help South Korea to change in a positive way.
Yeah.
I think that's all what we have prepared for this discussion.
Okay.
Thank you for your insights.
Thank you for having me. It was a wonderful chance to speak with you.